You're with Steve Austin on ABC Radio Brisbane.
Wednesday the 16th of May, lovely to have you along. You remember I brought you the story yesterday of a lady in Brisbane who was doing a one-person protest outside the Australian Veterinarians conference.
So we need to get our animals eating fresh food, and it's raw meaty bones.
Maria is her name. She's there again today, and she made a number of interesting observations in the interview with me yesterday. And as we had such a reaction to that story, and as I promised you, we're pursuing that in just a few moments when I'll speak with a vet who is very concerned about commercially produced pet food available here and around the world. His name is Dr. Tom Lonsdale, and we'll be hearing from him soon. I'll also be hearing from the Australian Veterinarians Association. They're calling for the health standard or regulation of pet food health to be made mandatory. I was surprised to learn that currently it's a voluntary code at the moment for pet food health manufactured by these big global conglomerates. The AVA, the representative body of veterinarians in Australia, is calling for that food standard to be made mandatory. So you'll be hearing from the AVA in a very short period of time as well. Lovely to have you along. 1300 222 612 is the phone number. You can give me a call on the issue of pet food and the health of your pet, or send a text 0467 922 612 anytime. It's 22 degrees in Brisbane, Bayside 21, Logan 22, Ipswich 23, the Gold Coast 20 and the Sunshine Coast 22 degrees. So consider the uproar if dental schools received funding from soft drink corporations in order to push the consumption of sugary drinks. What would happen to medical institutions or the medical schools if they educated their students on the issue of obesity using textbooks sponsored by fast food companies? These ideas may seem like an outrageous conflict of interest, yet my next guest has been arguing for decades that our veterinary institutions are essentially doing just that. Now, let me replay you a brief excerpt from the interview I brought you yesterday with Maria Koljanik. Her cat sadly died. This is just a brief reminder of some of her story yesterday.
My cat got fat eating pet food. So I was buying pet food from Coles and Woolies, just the standard Snappy's Tom and Whiskas. And unbeknown to me, I didn't know the contents of that food.
You took your cat to the vet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I took my cat to the vet with obesity, and the vet said, you need to put your cat on Royal Canin weight loss management sachets. So I did that, and the cat actually got fatter.
This continued, and sadly, your cat died.
Eventually, it ended up with $15,000 out-of-pocket expense, and a fat diabetic cat, no teeth, with a feeding tube in it, and eventually it died.
That's just a brief reminder of yesterday's story. Now, we've put in calls to Royal Canin. I must say they were extremely difficult to get hold of. I've never seen anything where we had to go through the organisation Vision Australia, the site representative body of visually impaired people, who also have the umbrella responsibilities for Guide Dogs Australia, who apparently have some sort of relationship with the pet food company. Eventually, we got onto the pet food company and we've requested an interview from them. Now, many pet foods are being sold at veterinary practices across Australia as prescription pet foods. But my guest, Dr. Tom Lonsdale, argues that not only are these foods not beneficial to your pet, but they may be actively harming them. Now, Dr. Tom Lonsdale is a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and is the principal vet at the Bligh Park Pet Health Centre in New South Wales. Dr. Tom Lonsdale, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Steve.
And I believe for many years, nearly over 3 decades, you were here in Brisbane, is that right?
That's right. Jupiter's Casino, wherever that is up there. And yeah, we brought an AGM motion before the Australian Veterinary Association saying the whole thing was an absolute disgrace and something should be done about it.
All right, let me just go back. I want to go through these step by step. Is there an obesity crisis in Australian pets today?
Oh, absolutely, yes. There's a health crisis right across the board because they're all fed junk food and so therefore they can't be well. Impossible.
Is there any credible evidence or independent research that links the issue of their obesity to commercially produced pet food?
Credible evidence, credible research.
Independent research that the obesity crisis is linked to commercially produced pet food.
Well, look, they're fed commercial food, and therefore there's a ready assumption that that's where it comes from. So we can make that assumption straight out. It comes from the food. You don't need double-blind crossover studies to confirm that.
The pet food company Royal Canin earlier this year released a media release looking at the potential reasons behind what they say is a pet obesity crisis. And they point to the owners of the pets, that owners hold the key to healthy weight by ignoring begging and monitoring food quantity. And I'm quoting from this pet food company's actual press release. Is there the possibility that pet owners themselves are responding to begging from animals and are creating the obesity problem in their own pets?
Holding the victims responsible for their own victimization is not appropriate. Absolutely not. The pet owner has no option other than to take in what's conveyed to them in their living rooms through the TV tube and what they see in the vet surgery.
Well, hang on, Tom, they do. I mean, they can make their own choices. Human beings are creatures with their own brain. They make, rational choices, hopefully. And if their pet's getting heavier, they can say, well, you don't need much food because you're getting too big.
Well, Steve, it doesn't just come down to that. I mean, this is not just an obesity issue. There's a whole host of other things wrong with the junk foods that the poor animals are being caused to consume. So shifting the discussion over onto, well, look, it's the owner's fault, when the owner's given no other option, walk down the so-called pet food aisle and there's no option but the canned junk that's doing the harm, then they really don't have a ready supply of information. And don't forget, of course, that we blew the whistle back in 1991 and effectively been silenced ever since.
What did you blow the whistle on back in 1991, Dr. Tom Lonsdale?
Okay, the profession being in bed with the junk pet food industry, that there was at that time a massive epidemic, and still is, of rotten mouths in all these animals, the stinking dog breath that we're also familiar with, is all to do with these animals being deprived of their opportunity, their birthright, to rip and tear and chew at their natural food. Instead, they're required to consume this starch-laden junk out of the can and packet. And let me say that in the natural state, the modified the wolves and the desert predators, the cats, have no starch in their food, like zero, none. So what happens with starch in the carnivore digestive tract? It gets converted into glucose, right? That's what the body does. It absorbs the starch, turns it into glucose. The body says, oh, whoops, I'm overwhelmed with glucose, don't need any of this. So we then find that the cells turn that into fat and lay it down in fat deposits throughout the body, simultaneously putting a huge drain on the pancreas, which is having to deal with this flood of glucose through the body, and therefore, again, explaining why you've got an epidemic of diabetes in cats. So all of these things are linked back to putting, effectively, poisonous junk through our domestic carnivores, completely unlike what they would be fed if they were in the zoo.
So you are part of a movement that says that pets need to have more natural food, more natural meat and bones for their own dietary health, essentially. Well, that's right, but if you like, that's half the story, because we've labelled this stuff food. Look, the deer racing through the woods pursued by a pack of wolves doesn't have food written on it anywhere. Neither does it have medicine written on it. But in truth, that's why the wolves are chasing that deer, because they need the food and medicine on a pretty regular basis. What do I mean by the medicine? Well, the ripping and tearing and chewing, because of the tough, chewy texture, then straight away cleans the teeth, vitally important, and massages the gums. Okay. Simultaneously, it stimulates the brain chemicals, which then in turn stimulate the immune system.
simultaneously, and I'm talking the medicinal aspects of eating the proper food.
My guest is Dr. Tom Lonsdale, member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Sorry, I cut you off, Tom Lonsdale.
You're all right. That's fine. Look, this is a huge subject, and we've really got to go right back to basics and understand that because we tend to label things in the hope of understanding them better, actually sometimes we wrong-foot ourselves. We confound ourselves with an oversimplification. The proper food and medicine for your carnivore ideally should come fur-wrapped, feather-wrapped, or with fins. Fur, feathers, and fins should characterize the natural food of our carnivores, whether they be wild or in the zoo or modified and domesticated. They all have the same needs.
Well, that's going to be difficult in a very urbanised place like Australia or Brisbane is. So let me just move on to and just get some answers from you on a couple of points. The Australian Veterinarian Association is calling for the mandatory regulation of pet food health standards. At the moment, apparently, I was surprised to hear this, but it's a voluntary code. So the commercial producers of pet food, which are owned by the two big food conglomerates of the world, Mars Incorporated is one, and Colgate-Palmolive is one of the other major ones. I think there's a third one, but let's just stick with these two majors. At the moment, the commercially supplied or for sale pet food in Australia is a voluntary code. The AVA, the Veterinarians Representative Association, is calling for mandatory regulation of pet food health standards. Would that be a good move?
No.
Why not?
Because this junk shouldn't be sold at all. Period. This idea that you just shift the goalpost and talk about something else and therefore say, right, we've wrapped our arms around this and we're now taking care of it. So all of you folks, you mushrooms, go back to sleep. No. This is completely inappropriate. Steve, you did say, of course, that, my gold star standard, fur, feathers and fins, could be hard to replicate in the urban environment. But actually something not far removed from that can be done really very simply indeed. Whole chicken frames after the meat's been cut off for human consumption, kangaroo tails, lamb shanks, that sort of thing, whole fish trimmings, so on. The animals don't need to suffer. They can get the necessary teeth cleaning and the right nutrients completely without the starch and the carbohydrates.
So simply by pet owners essentially going to a butcher to buy, sort of offcuts from a butcher essentially in most cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Or go to my website and all the information's there. It's easy peasy. And all my clients do this, and of course they don't come back with sick animals, so that's a bit of a problem from a commercial point of view, but never mind. We're gratified to know that our patients are healthy.
All right, now you've been a big critic of the relationship in commercial business and the veterinary schools in Australia. So let me ask you a couple of questions. I just want to make sure that we don't unfairly name anyone or defame anyone here, but is it true that major pet food suppliers are also the providers of special dietary pet foods that are prescribed as the solution to the dietary problems in pets by vets in Australia? In other words, they supply the commercial food, then they supply the pharmaceutical or medicinal food, for want of a better term.
Yeah. It's a fraud upon a fraud upon a fraud, yes. Yeah, this should not happen in the first instance. I mean, look, we now have warning labels on the sides of cigarette packets. I mean, this junk on the supermarket shelf requires the same. Feed this to your pet and it's going to have a shortened life and be effectively tortured every day of its miserable existence.
Is it true that many pet owners are being told by vets to purchase certain brands or types of pet foods?
Yes, absolutely. It starts out, you see, what happened, originally the animals weren't fed any of this stuff at all, but then the sleepy veterinary profession woke up a little bit and said, maybe it's acceptable to feed this stuff. Then they next moved to say, it's not only acceptable, it's beneficial. And then they went to the next stage and said, not only it's beneficial, it's the best. Simultaneously, they were disparaging and denigrating the natural alternative.
All right.
So that's the background to this. And then they say, right, we got coast clear, and we now, because we're the authority in this area, can now prescribe all this stuff. So you go to the average vet, and there's an array of different so-called medicinal food products, all of which are hugely harmful.
Can I get you to stay on the line? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Just stay on the line. So I want to speak with my next guest, because we've managed to get hold of someone who's very, very busy, and I want to speak to her and not miss the opportunity of talking with her. So that's Dr. Tom Lonsdale. Tom Lonsdale is a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and is a principal vet at the Bligh Park Pet Health Centre in New South Wales. Let's go to Dr. Paula Parker. She's president of the Australian Veterinarian Association. Paula Parker, the AVA is calling for the mandatory regulation of pet food health standards in Australia. Why is that?
Good afternoon. So one of the things that we discuss as part of our policy is that all pet food in Australia, we want consumers to have confidence that pet food's of a high standard. So at the moment in Australia, compliance with the Australian standard is voluntary, and we would like to see everybody in Australia comply with that minimum standard.
Why do you want it changed? What's the problem?
I guess when we look forward into the future, at this stage we've got a lot of responsible companies who do voluntarily comply, but there's
How do you know if no one's monitoring it?
There's a system through the Pet Food Industry Association where people can certify that they're complying, and there's an audit process through the Pet Food Industry Association through which they say people are complying. So there's a burden of proof that's required through the Industry Association.
So it's self-monitoring, essentially, Dr. Parker?
Yeah, there's a level of self-monitoring in the industry, and that we encourage the people that do invest to do that. But because there are low barriers to be able to sell food in Australia that's marketed as pet food, there are more people who don't comply with the standards. And what's important for consumers to understand is what quality food and nutrition is for their pet.
My guest is Dr. Paula Parker. She's president of the Australian Veterinarian Association. She's in Brisbane with thousands of other vets for the national conference that's underway here. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. So currently it's a voluntary code, and you want it mandatory. So how would that be enforced? Would there be some sort of regulatory agency? Would the AVA be the body that says we will monitor this? Who would do that, Paula Parker?
Yeah, there are a number of regulatory schemes in other countries, and so they can vary between food being looked at as a part of food safety, like human food is looked at, or as part of the agriculture sector. And in Australia, several years ago, the chief veterinarians who provide advice to the Agriculture Minister looked at the regulation of pet food in Australia, and their conclusion was that the industry is self-regulating and that the Australian standards are of a high standard, and they didn't recommend regulation at that point in time based on their assessment of the industry. But certainly things have changed in that period of time. There are more players that have come into the market, and there are low barriers for entry to the market. So the Agriculture Minister, Minister Littleproud, has requested that group of veterinarians, who are the chief veterinary officers across Australia, to have a look at the regulatory framework and re-examine that decision and seek consultation with industry bodies and members of the public to provide a recommendation to the Minister as to whether the regulatory environment of pet food should change in Australia.
What is the AVA's, the Veterinarians Association's position on the global obesity problem with pets currently? What's the AVA's position?
Certainly we're seeing as individual veterinarians, and what we hear from our members, is that more and more pets are suffering from obesity. And one of the things that we know both from our personal experience when we're in clinical practice, but also from evidence-based studies, is that obesity contributes to so many diseases and makes so many diseases worse for our pets.
Where does your research come from to reach that position? As far as I understand, most of the research is done by the pet food manufacturers themselves.
There are a couple of the leading pet food manufacturers invest heavily in research and development. And so one of their key things that they bring is saying we want the veterinary profession to be able to recommend things that are evidence-based, because as professionals that's really important for us.
Yes.
So they engage in a lot of their own research and development. And then there's research and development that happens out of commercial companies, so through the university system. And then there are people who, as part of their master's study or their PhD study, will review all of the literature that's available currently in the market, make an assessment of that literature. One of the things that we have with all literature is published is authors are required to declare their interest as part of the literature that's published. And so when anyone's examining a paper, they can look at those authors and say, okay, where might these authors have come? Have they presented objective data? And are the conclusions that they've made on the basis of that data valid?
I've learnt that, say, that a couple of the really big pet food manufacturers like Hills and Royal Canin, who are both sponsors of your conference here in Brisbane at the moment, I note, are also have their advertisements actually in something like the Sydney University Centre for Veterinary Education course notes. In other words, the advertising, the material from the pet food companies is actually deep within the course notes of some veterinary education centres around Australia. Is that troubling to you? Does that surprise you?
One of the things that's really important for all veterinarians and veterinary students also is to be aware of all of the products that are available on the market.
Shouldn't they be aware of the science rather than the product?
So it's part of being aware of the science. So as part of your undergraduate education, you're taught the basics in nutrients. So you're taught about macro and micronutrients, the different requirements for different species and different phases of growth depending on the age of the animal. So for an example, a puppy has a very different nutrient requirement to a dog that's 12 and a half. So as part of your undergraduate teaching, you do a nutrition subject where you learn about all of the basics of nutrition. So you learn nutrition physiology and what we call pathophysiology, so nutrition in disease states where things have gone wrong. And then as part of your final clinical years where you're about to go into practice and you're going to recommend to people, okay, here is a problem, part of your job as a veterinarian is to explain what are all of the possible remedies for that problem. And so it's important for new graduate veterinarians and graduated veterinarians to be aware of all of the available options. And so what we will do is assess all of those available options. And the reason why we have a relationship with the pet food companies is that they do provide therapeutic options to the veterinary market. And so our members want to be able to understand the research that the pet food companies bring, to be able to ask them questions on the basis of their research and hear their answers so that they can make an assessment what is the best thing for their clients and their pet and their situation. And that recommendation will depend on the individual situation of the client and what they're able to accommodate and the disease state of their pet.
So the company supplies the pet food, supplies the research, has their advertising buried in the university course notes that teaches the veterinarians, and supplies and manufactures the pharmaceutical food products when the pets get sick as well.
They supply material, they make the students aware of their products, and they have big research and development arms of their organisations, and that's something that we encourage. We want all companies within our sector to be innovative and to base that innovation on research. But there's research that happens within the companies, and then there's research that happens in other areas, so research in universities, for example. And then as part of people who are undergoing further degree qualifications, part of their further qualifications are to look at all of the available research and assess that research, and then they publish what are essentially summary papers that state what is the status of all of the research, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these various papers, so that people understand the base of evidence that's out there.
I really appreciate you coming on this afternoon. I know you're very busy with your conference. Thank you very much.
No worries, thank you.
Dr. Paula Parker, President of the Australian Veterinarian Association. They've got their major conference in Brisbane at the moment. Dr. Tom Lonsdale, are you still with me?
Well, I'm almost fallen off my chair, but pick myself up.
Well,
yes.
let me get your reaction to that. Give me your reaction to that as someone who says it's not good enough to call for mandatory research. We've just learnt that the pet food companies make the pet food, supply the research, have their advertising products buried in the course notes where the vets learn their trade, and then supply the pharmaceutical product on the other side.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a huge brainwashing scam that is completely entrenched in the system.
So what should the AVA, as the governing body or the representative body of veterinarians in Australia, what should they be examining in this?
Well, first off, they should come clean and say, whoops, we made a mistake. Sorry. That's what I had to do back in the 1980s, early 90s. We woke up and thought, goodness gracious, what I've been taught at the vet school in 1972 was completely bogus and wrong, and I've been injuring my patient's health. That's what any vet with any integrity should be doing straight off. And that way, that clears the slate, and then you can somewhat, a little bit, forgive them for having past mistakes.
Look,
and then say, right, well, we want to atone, we want to make amends. Now, back to Dr. Paula Parker. Now, she's the current president of the AVA, but the president back in 1993 tried to resist what we were saying to the association at Jupiter's Casino up there. But nevertheless, we got an AGM motion up before the assembled members that said, yeah, okay, we will look into the effects of diet and disease, right? So we're going to connect diet with disease and look at that and have a research paper done. Well, backroom wheeling and dealing followed on from that, and then they reduced it down to diet and periodontal disease. In other words, mouth rot, the septic mouth that all these animals have. And we'll look at that. They spent $7,000 employing Dr. David Watson at Sydney University to look into the whole thing. He came back with a finding, Lonsdale is actually right about this. And yes, all the animals are horribly ill as a result of not ripping and tearing and chewing at their proper food.
Right.
Because the periodontal disease, like the obesity that Dr. Paula Parker alluded to, creates all sorts of other problems within the body. So, but what did they do? Did they then say, right, okay, we as a responsible body, the Australian Veterinary Association, will look into this? No, they shelved the report. But the report is there. It's on my website. Everyone can go and look at it.
All right.
If they're tip the wink.
All right, look, I will continue this discussion on another occasion. It's absolutely fascinating to me and quite a revelation. Dr. Tom Lonsdale, thank you very much for your time. I'd love to speak with you again. Appreciate you coming on this afternoon. Thank you. All the best. Dr. Tom Lonsdale, he's a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and is a principal vet at the Bligh Park Pet Health Centre in New South Wales. Prior to that, we spoke with the current president of the Australian Veterinarian Association, Dr. Paula Parker. The AVA is currently holding their national conference here in Brisbane.